been over a month since I returned from the Redwoods. I thoroughly enjoyed spending those 5 days exploring the beautiful forests, and I'm very happy with the work I produced. In the past, it wasn't uncommon for me to spend upwards of 10 days in the field, but now it seems I burn out much faster. I think some of that's because I'm much more productive now and I'm able to produce more work over a shorter period of time. I've been going on these trips for 10 years now, but I still tend to get a bit homesick at times. I learned from my winter trip that these solo adventures are much more satisfying if I break them into 2 smaller portions, with a short visit home in between. This allows me to rest up, to relax, and to head into the second part of the trip with a fresh perspective. My original plan was to set out on this backpacking trip to southern Utah before visiting the Redwoods, but the weather wasn't ideal. It's been a very wet spring and the forecast called for nearly constant rain for the duration of my stay. I postponed my trip and planned to give it a second shot a few days after returning from the Redwoods. The weather was a bit better then, but the forecast still called for cloudy skies and a good chance of rain, so I postponed the trip once more. The roads leading to this trailhead become impassable when wet, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck, especially after a lengthy 12-hour drive. Several more weeks have passed and the storm window is now closed. The weather forecast calls for mostly sunny skies with a chance of afternoon clouds. These are great conditions for photographing the canyons, but my one hesitation is the temperature. It's going to be very hot with an expected high of 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius. I know my own limits, and this is at the upper range of what I consider to be safe. I'll be hiking long distances over rough terrain with a nearly 60-pound pack, but thankfully, there's plenty of water down in the canyons. My goal is to stay as hydrated as possible and enjoy the cool shade of the numerous side canyons that I'll be visiting. It's nearly the summer solstice and there's plenty of daylight to spare, so even after the 12-hour drive from Southern California, I have plenty of time to hit the trail and reach my intended campsite before sundown. To help with this, my pack is fully loaded and ready to go. My goal is to spend upwards of 5 days down in the canyons, visiting some familiar places and spending a lot of time exploring new areas as well. When heading on these trips, I often have a feeling of hesitation, but there's something very different about this trip. With a successful trip to the Redwoods now behind me, much of my work is already complete, and I'm genuinely excited to be in Utah. This is a story of my spring of 2019 backpacking trip to the canyons of southern Utah. And that is the final video clip I have from this trip because moments later, my Sony RX100 was destroyed. And I know what you guys are thinking. I just spent all that time producing this intro, the voiceover, everything else. I mean, that thing took me 4 days to make, from putting the clips together, finding the right music, creating the voiceover, and all that sort of stuff that goes into it. And here's the thing though, when I create these videos, I want to kind of take you along for the ride and kind of show you the same experience I had when I was out in the field. And when I was heading on that trip, I was genuinely excited to be there. I had a really good feeling about the trip. But once I got to the trailhead, yeah, things were a little bit off. So basically, I'm going to take you back about 2 hours before the camera was destroyed. And as I was driving up to the trailhead, it was not 86 degrees. It was somewhere between 91 and 92 degrees. It's kind of fluctuating between the two. That's pretty hot. That is a lot hotter than I actually felt comfortable, but I did check the weather forecast and I knew that in the days to come, it was going to cool down dramatically and it would just be in the 70s at a certain point. So I felt better about that. I knew that if I could just, last those first 2 days and kind of deal with it, then I'd be fine. There's plenty of water down in the canyons. My goal was just drink plenty of water, stay in the shade, and everything would be just fine. On my hike in, I definitely took quite a few breaks kind of to relax a little bit in the shade and just not work too hard. And also, it was kind of in the later afternoon. I started to cool down a little bit already. So those are some of my thoughts as I was hiking in that day. So on this hike, it's a hike that I've done many times before, and it's a route that I'm very, very familiar with. And there are 2 river crossings that I have to go through, and typically it's no big deal. So it's like this gentle kind of stream that you cross. But when I reached the first river crossing, and by this point I was very far into the hike, kind of at a point of no return because hiking back out of there, it would have just taken too much energy at that point. But I saw that the river was flowing higher than usual. It was not in a way that really was, it didn't alarm me in any ways, but I just definitely took note of the fact that the water was murkier than usual and the river was a little bit higher than usual. If I felt it was unsafe to cross, I would have probably camp right there for the night and maybe headed out because I would need to cross that river to get where I wanted to go. But as I approached the river, kind of looked at it, and normally what I'd do is I'd hike straight across the river and then sort of climb up this embankment on the other side of the river. And in most years, it's about knee deep in that area, and a little shallower as you kind of reach the shore. But I knew that I probably wouldn't be able to do that on this trip because it would have been a struggle getting up that other bank with the water level being a little bit higher. So I was trying to find another way of doing that. So I found that if I could walk downstream a little ways, and you're sort of walking through this channel where there's this rock wall on the right and kind of a steep riverbank on the left side, but you just kind of walk downriver a little bit, just walk in the river itself. There's a nice gentle bend to the river, and at that point you can kind of sort of climb up the embankment on the other side, and that was no big deal. I knew that if anything were to happen, I can come out the exact same way I came in, no problem at all. So now I have about 2 miles or so to go, just kind of hiking through this kind of dense forested area at times. It's kind of slow going, but eventually you kind of find a trail and kind of hike along it as you saw in the videos. And then you reach a second river crossing. Now the second river crossing is very close to where I'm going to be camping for the night. It's a canyon I've been to many times before, and originally my goal for this trip was to do a lot of exploring, kind of head up the main canyon, check out all these other side canyons, but I knew with the river the way it was that really wasn't going to be a possibility, and instead what I really should do is just focus my attention on the canyon I already know, because there's a couple shots in there I kind of was looking forward to taking. So I reached the second river crossing, and the second river crossing is a little bit more tricky because you have pretty good sized river banks on either side of the river that there's a lot of vegetation there. It's kind of hard to go through and to cross there, but there's really two areas in particular where you can drop into the river. And on all the years I've done this hike in the past, as you sort of ease into the river, it's about knee deep, and then pretty quickly it starts to get shallow again to the point where you're sort of hiking in areas that's, you know, maybe like shin deep and maybe even less than that. Maybe it doesn't even go up to the top of your boots. So I knew that there's gonna be a little bit of a deeper area, but then beyond that, it was gonna be shallow. So I'm kind of standing on the edge of the river there, and kind of have my feet in it just a little bit. The water's pretty murky, so you can't see how deep it is. So I have my trekking poles in front of me, just kind of feeling around to kind of get a feel for it. And I walk in a little bit more. I'm standing on kind of this sediment sandbar, I guess you would say. But I feel ahead, I see that it's getting deeper and deeper. Eventually I get to an area where I'm kind of leaning forward, kind of feeling for it. And I realize that I can't feel the bottom of the river anymore. It's probably about chest deep in an area where in the years past it would have been about knee deep. Part of that's because the river level is higher, but also part of it's because it's kind of eroded out that part of the river. And as I'm kind of realizing that it's pretty deep ahead of me, the sand that I'm standing on just kind of crumbles out from underneath me, and I fall into the river. And I gotta say, I kind of panicked a little bit because I have a 60-pound pack on. I am getting swept down current in the river, and I don't know exactly what's gonna happen at this point. I'm floating pretty well, which is nice, but I'm also kind of panicking. I'm just kind of using my trekking poles, which are kind of, I have wrist straps on them, so I'm not gonna lose a trekking pole, but I have those. I'm kind of feeling around as I'm getting swept down river. Eventually, I get to the point where my feet touch the bottom again, and I'm able to sort of cross over to the other side of the river. I'm still in the river at this point, but it's a lot shallower over there. And I kind of like walk up the river and then follow it over to the area where I'm gonna go into the side canyon, which is where I'm gonna have my campsite for the night. And I am completely soaked, head to toe, completely soaked. My backpack actually didn't get all that wet. And I think a lot of that is because of how I had things packed. So I always pack my sleeping bag in the bottom of my backpack, just because if you're setting it down, you don't have to worry about crushing it. You know, it's just kind of cushioning it at that point. But I don't bring a tent on these backpacking trips. I bring a bivy sack, and a bivy sack it's basically just a waterproof, weather-resistant bag that you put the sleeping bag in, and very lightweight, but if you happen to be sleeping for the night and rain comes over, you're gonna be protected. Your sleeping bag's not gonna get wet. But I put the sleeping bag inside the bivy, and I kind of cram that in the bottom of my pack. And since it is waterproof, since you have all the down on the inside from the sleeping bag, it's incredibly buoyant. So I think that is one of the reasons why I was able to stay afloat as well as I was. Even though I had a 60-pound pack on, it was very buoyant at the bottom, which really helped out and kind of gave me some stability as I'm kind of struggling in the current. So I reached my campsite. I'm soaked, but I'm not too concerned about that because it's pretty warm. And I know that my clothes are going to dry really, really fast. All synthetic stuff that I wear, so you don't have to worry about, if you're wearing jeans and stuff like that, they'll stay wet a long time, but synthetic stuff will dry really fast, which is why I wear that out there. But I kind of start going through everything I have as I'm setting up my camp. I pull out my sleeping bag. It got just a tiny little bit wet, but it all basically stayed dry, which is nice. And it was then at that point that I realized that my saddlebags, now that's where I store my video equipment. So I have my RX100, microphone, audio recorder, batteries, all that sort of stuff in one of the saddlebags. The other one is more of like survival gear. So it's my titanium pot, the stove, the water filtration tablets, all that sort of stuff is in the other one. And normally if I'm going through a little bit of a deeper river crossings, I just take those saddlebags, I kind of pull them up top. I can kind of secure them up high, make sure nothing gets wet. But I have the stuff packed that way so I can access it really easily on the trail. But I fell in the river so fast with such little notice, I didn't have time to do that. And it was only when I got to the camp that I realized that my entire video kit at that point was destroyed. Though thankfully my iPhone, I had that in the top of my pack, so that actually survived just fine. So I do have a couple more clips here and there for this video, but I just don't have the main stuff for my RX100. And there's another thing too. So once I got to camp, there's some water in that canyon, so I was able to sort of purify the water. I had 6 liters going. I make myself some dinner. And at this point, I really just want to reach out to my wife and just say, hey, I'm fine, everything's fine. It's just a little bit of a crazy adventure. And so I sent some messages on my Garmin inReach, which is a satellite messenger. And I had actually sent her a message when I first arrived at the trailhead, but I hadn't got any responses, which is weird because normally we're really fast to send messages back and forth. And throughout the course of the hike, I sort of sent her some messages, and at a certain point, something just didn't quite seem right with that. So there's a sort of a test message automated reply thing you can do where you can send a test message and it'll send it back if it got it. And that worked, so I knew that my satellite messenger was working. I requested a weather report on it and I received that, and that worked out fine. And then when I was at camp, I sent a message to my parents basically saying, hey, I'm here, everything's fine, and I got a message from them pretty fast. And so as the time was going on, I still wasn't hearing from my wife. I sent a message to my parents asking if they could give her a call and make sure everything's fine. And as it turns out, she did not receive a single message that I had sent. Even though I had tested the device before heading out in the field, she did not get a single message, but all the other messages to all the other people and all the other stuff was working fine. So we later found out that I was able to send messages to her email account, and that worked okay. But at this point, I am at camp. I'm kind of settled in for the night. It's starting to get a little cooler, which is nice, and had a nice meal in my belly. And even though I was down the video camera, I was still determined to go out for the purpose of photography and head into this canyon the next day because there's a couple subjects in mind I really wanted to photograph. And in some ways, maybe not doing the video just meant it would be a little less work for me. But it definitely felt like something was missing by not being able to record the whole process. But yeah, so it was a heck of a first day, and I was just thankful to be at my campsite and that at least all the large format camera gear survived the swim. All right, so let's talk about day 2. So I had a pretty good night's sleep. It didn't really get cold at night, but it definitely was quite comfortable. And when I woke up the next morning, it was one of those days where you can tell that it was gonna be a hot day. I mean, it was kind of cool in the morning, but you could just feel that it was gonna be a really hot day. So I definitely wanted to take it easy on that day. I didn't really want to do anything too rigorous, really. And I really want to kind of stay in some of the side canyons where it's shady, drink tons of water and all that. So this canyon where I've been in this canyon before, and there were 2 subjects I had in mind that I wanted to photograph. One of them was going to make for hopefully an ideal morning photo. The other one's more of a kind of an afternoon, early evening sort of subject. The morning photo was about 2 miles up the canyon, and as I've hiked to that subject, I'm going to pass by the subject that would hopefully become my afternoon subject. So I'm kind of getting my gear together, I'm kind of hiking along, and up ahead of me on the trail, I I hear something kind of weird. Now these canyons, you'll hear birds in the morning. It's really peaceful down in there. Now I know I'm hearing a cow. There's a cow ahead of me somewhere on the trail, but it was a very angry sounding cow. And honestly, it sounded more like I'm in Jurassic Park than I'm on a farm. So I hear this cow ahead of me. It sounds like it's perhaps in distress or it's angry, or I don't know what it is, but all I know is I probably should not be walking directly towards it as it is. So I kind of stopped and I recorded a little bit of video on my iPhone just to kind of record my reaction to what was going on. That's pretty creepy sounding, I gotta say. It's a cow, but dude, it's a double cow. So after recording that, I kind of went kind of around where the cow was going to be up ahead, because I didn't want to kind of meet it head on the trail, because I didn't know what was going on or really what to expect. So as I kind of make my way around, I kind of lay eyes on it, and it's this giant bull actually that's just in the middle of the trail, and it looks like it's agitated. It's kind of like stomping around a little bit, and it sees me. It just like is staring like right at me. I'm a long ways away from it, but I didn't really know what to expect. Now the reason it's down in the canyon is that there's sort of grazing land up top, and some of the cattle will kind of work their way down in there and kind of, I don't know whether they're just trying to get away from the ranchers or they just like it down there, but it is nice down there. I don't blame them, but this big bull was down there all by itself, and it was at the base of this really large sort of alcove of sandstone. It's just mooing as loud as it can and just echoing and thundering off all the canyon walls. So it's just staring me down, and I'm just kind of sitting there trying to figure out, is it gonna charge me? What's gonna happen? And then it gets a little bit more agitated, and then it just turns around and it bolts down canyon. So it just goes the opposite direction, which is great. So I avoided the big angry dinosaur cow, so that's always nice. So I continue on my way towards my morning location. And it's this tree that's in this side canyon that I've wanted to photograph for a couple of years now. But in years past, I found that my normal lens, which is a 300, was a bit too long, and my 150, which is my wide angle lens, was definitely too wide. So this time I had a 240 millimeter lens, and the light in the morning is very fleeting. It doesn't last very long. And eventually some direct sunlight kind of streams onto the wall in the background behind the tree and kind of ruins the shot. So I didn't think I was gonna have an opportunity to actually expose some film, but what I did want to do was set up my camera with this different lens, this 240 millimeter Fuji lens, see if I could find a composition so at least I'll know for the next day. So I hike all the way in there, set up my camera, set up a vertical composition of this tree, set it up against this nice sandstone wall in this little bend of the canyon. And I actually find that the window for light is quite long this time of year. So it's been about 2 months or so since when I've visited this sort of canyon in the past. Usually I go there in like late April and May, but here I am in kind of like late June. And I actually have a much nicer window for light. So I managed to expose a sheet of Velvia 50 as well as a sheet of Ektar 100. And I even have time to find a horizontal composition as well. Again, expose some Velvia, expose some Ektar. Of those, I definitely preferred the vertical composition. It just was more natural to the tree. And at this point in time, I felt pretty good. After exposing the film, then the wind kicked up, and then the sunlight kind of streamed under the wall in the background. So I managed to be in the right place at the right time, and I was happy with the composition I'd selected. And on this trip, I brought only 3 film holders, which gives me a total of 6 photos I can shoot. But what I did do is I brought a box of fresh film and also a box to put the exposed film in and my changing tent. So at this point I had exposed pretty much all of my film, and I just am kind of sitting on the ground at the base of the sandstone wall in this side canyon. I have my changing tent in front of me. I'm just kind of my arms in there loading film. There's a nice little breeze going through the canyon, and it's strange when the moment that you're loading film on a trip actually ends up becoming the most memorable part of the trip and the most relaxing part of the trip. but being forced to just sit there and load the film was actually one of the most peaceful moments on that trip. And I think it says a lot about the trip in general. So after kind of getting the film reloaded and stuff, and it was now kind of midday, I hiked all the way back to where my campsite was. I just want to make some lunch. I wanted to check on my Sony camera, which I kind of left there in the sun to see if it would air out and maybe come back to life. And it hadn't, which, no surprise there. But then I went down to the river just to kind of check things out. And I couldn't figure out if my eyes were playing a trick on me, but it looked like the river was a little bit higher than the day before. And I gotta say, this was kind of scary because I know that I only just kind of barely made it in there the day before. And if the river was any higher, then that would pose a bit of a concern. So I grabbed some sticks and kind of stuck them there kind of at the edge of the river. And that way I can kind of monitor how high the river was. And just, if anything, just for peace of mind, saying, hey, it's all the same, you can get out of here and it's all right. So after that, after having lunch, after checking on the river, I headed over to the afternoon location. And by then, there was no trace of the bull anymore. It was gone, which was great. And there was this bush kind of set up against the sandstone wall I tried to photograph last time. I wasn't quite happy with it. And I set up a composition. Now, in retrospect, after shooting the photo, I kind of realized that my camera wasn't quite placed ideally. I really should have had it about a foot or foot and a half to the left so that the subject this bush lined up better with the background wall. And I kind of knew that right away, but at the same time, in the back of my mind, I'm just thinking about that river. Is the river going up? And it was kind of impairing my own judgment when it comes to like the photography and everything else along those lines, which is probably for good reason. So after shooting that photo, I exposed 2 sheets of Velvia 50, it's vertical composition. After shooting that, pack things up, head back to camp. And this is about the time when I really should be making dinner. I really should be kind of getting things ready for the night and just kind of relaxing back at camp. I go down there, put my pack down and kind of start getting things ready for dinner. And then I kind of wander down to the river, go down there, and all my sticks are gone. And that kind of gave me a major moment of pause. And I had my confirmation that the river was rising. And as I stood there, I saw some other little bits of debris, very minor stuff, like some twigs and sticks and stuff kind of floating down the river. And I realized that I had a decision to make. I really couldn't risk that river getting any higher than it was. And I knew I needed to do something about it. So I go back to camp, pack up everything, and decide I'm gonna get out of here. Because if I don't get out of here now, what's gonna happen tomorrow? Is it gonna be even higher? And beyond that, how long is it gonna take for that river to drop back down again? So I pack everything up, and by this point, it's going on 6 o'clock in the evening. So I knew that if I can at least get past those 2 river crossings, maybe I can camp on the other side of the river once I'm clear and safe of all of it, and then I can hike out the next morning. But that voice in the back of my head said, get out of here now. So that's what I did. Packed everything up, kind of retraced my steps. That river crossing where I went for a swim the first time, well, I went for a swim again. But this time I knew that the pack was gonna stay nice and buoyant, and I really wasn't worried about that part of it. I got swept downstream in the same spot. I was able to grab on some plants, kind of climb up on the riverbank, then hike the 2 or so miles back downriver. And eventually I go to what was that first river crossing. And I know at this point I'm basically home free. All I gotta do is get across that river and then it's all good. But there was a problem. When I got to that point in the river, I now realized how much it had risen. It had risen about a foot. So what was before knee-deep water is now waist-deep water. And to retrace the steps I had from the day before, I would need to now walk up current, upstream, along that, through that river, through a decently narrow area to get to where I can cross over on the other side. And I tried as hard as I could. I got my trekking poles. I'm trying. I can't fight the current. The current's too strong. And at this point, it kind of sets in that I can't come out the same way that I came in. And this is gonna be a little bit of a problem. There was another hiker who was also trying to fight the river, and he kind of gave up too. He said, you just can't do it. And the problem is that the bottom of the river, there was like this loose sediment, like pebbles and sand and stuff. And you just kind of dig into that and you just get no traction whatsoever. So the other hiker decided to kind of climb back up on the riverbank and sort of go upstream and see if we can find a way to kind of cross back. So I kind of follow him over there, and we're kind of going along there. But all the areas to go across, it's the narrower sections of the river, and the river is very deep. I mean, it's chest deep water in these areas. And we had sort of a moment of realization of this is not really a great situation. So then we kind of head a little further upstream. And now there are there's a couple people on the other side of the river that are trying to help us try to find a way to get across. And eventually we found an area where we can kind of cross diagonally through kind of a curve in the river. And the advantage of doing that is that it's sort of the middle of the river oftentimes where the sediment and stuff is a little bit higher. So we were able to hike through kind of waist deep water and avoid all the chest deep spots. But there's just this narrow area where you can pass through there. And again, the water was really murky, so you couldn't see how deep it was. So you just had to kind of hope that it was going to be all right. But now at least we can use the current to our advantage, kind of diagonally make our way across the river. And I gotta say, it was a massive relief to get across the river. It had risen about a foot in the matter of a day. And I gotta say, that was a little scary. So at that point, there was still a good amount of daylight left. I'd made pretty good time kind of getting to that point. So I just decided to hike the rest of the way back to my truck, which is gonna be a really long and a very grueling hike. But I figured if I get back to my truck by sundown, that would be great. So I just hit the trail, put my head down, hike away, and basically gave it everything I had. And eventually I got back to my truck just when a headlamp would have been necessary. And thankfully I made it when I did, just because my headlamp was also in one of those saddlebags. And when I got back to my truck, I realized that it wasn't working so well either. So I'm glad I didn't really need it. But if for some reason I wasn't able to make it back to my truck, I would have just camped wherever in my bivvy and just spent the night there. And then in the morning I would have hiked it the rest of the way. But it was pretty crazy. Just listening to that voice in the back of my head. And once I got back to my truck, I was so relieved. I was so glad to be out of there. And then I drove for about an hour or so to kind of get closer to the main highway, because I was so worn out, I was so exhausted. I didn't really want to head to any other places. I'd driven all the way to Utah, but I didn't really want to go anywhere else. I just wanted to go home at that point. And when I was kind of getting things ready to sleep in the back of my truck that night, I hopped out of my 4Runner just so I can kind of open the back and rearrange things. And I realized that I could hardly walk. I mean, my legs were so fatigued, the muscles were so fatigued. I literally had to use my arms and kind of move each leg because the muscles were just dead. So that particular day, since I had my phone with me, I do have my stats for that day. I'd hiked 13.2 miles and I had done almost 35,000 steps, and there were some pretty big elevation gains in there as well. But it was crazy. Now there's this concept when it comes to, I don't know if some of you guys might have heard of it, type 1 fun, type 2 fun. This is something I learned first from Alan Brock. So type 1 fun is something where in the moment it's really fun, and in retrospect it's really fun. Type 2 fun is something where in the moment it is misery. It is not enjoyable, it's not great, but afterwards it makes for a great story. I've also heard there's a type 3 fun, which is not fun in the moment, nor is it fun afterwards. I'd say this was a solid 2 to 2.5 fun. It was miserable. I destroyed a $1,000 video camera and some other stuff as well. But that photo I shot earlier in the day, the morning scene with that tree, that shot turned out. And it's the shot I've been wanting to take all these years by visiting that location. I think it does that area justice because it really captures just like this calm solitude and peacefulness in that canyon. So I'm glad that photo turned out. But it was an adventure. It was a long adventure. And I look forward to going back, but maybe when the river is a little lower, so we'll see on that. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next week. If you enjoy this ad-free and clickbait-free content and want to help me live my dream, a voluntary contribution of just $24 a year helps keep my gas tank full and my film freezer stocked. For more information on how to support me and my work, please visit the donation section of my website at benhorn.com/donate. I also have prints in my portfolio box set available on my website. You can find a direct link down below in the show notes. Thanks in advance for your support.